So my name is Richard Burdett. I'm a professor of urban studies at the London School of Economics, and I run a research centre called LSE Cities, which looks at how cities are changing internationally at a global scale. So The Endless City is the title of a book, but it's actually a research project which has been going on here at the London School of Economics for nearly 8 or 9 years. And it starts from what is now a familiar statistic that half the world is living in cities of one form or another, and that number is becoming greater and greater. And therefore we are literally talking about living in an endless city insofar as that more and more of the world is urbanized. But also in some cases the cities are becoming so big and so sprawling that you don't know whether they start and where they stop. So in that sense it's endless in different ways. But we're really interested in understanding what happens behind the numbers. It's not just a question of how many people, but what is the quality of life and what is the impact on the planet, effectively, of urbanization. Those are the sort of issues we are doing. So as a project, the way we've run it is that we've studied something like 10, 15 big cities around the world: Shanghai, New York, London, Mumbai, Istanbul, Hong Kong, and tried to understand and build up a sort of database, very objective database, around things like how many people are living there and how fast are they growing. Are they sprawling or are they more compact? Are they using energy in an efficient way? Are the Gini coefficients, which measures how unequal a city is, are those large or are they small? We're also beginning to look at issues to do with money and let's call it social equality, to try and understand whether cities actually in the end do better than nations in terms of actually improving people's prospects for getting jobs. And of course the answer is they do. So the Endless City becomes this project which looks at people's lives in terms of their economy, in terms of their social inclusion and environmental impacts in cities across the world. Well, I think before one speculates as to how cities can be improved or made better, made more sustainable in the next 10 to 30 years as more and more people move into them, we need to understand what's going wrong with them. And on the whole, if one slightly generalizes, with all the cities we've been looking at, you tend to see three things. Cities are becoming more socially exclusive. You actually find pockets of very rich and very poor people living in enclaves of one sort or another. That's one dimension. The second is that they're also becoming much more fragmented. You have areas where people shop, areas where people sleep, areas where people work. You don't have that combination, let's say, that you used to have in the medieval city and certainly in Europe, of bringing all these things together. And then, unfortunately, cities are also becoming, and this is the third point, environmentally more destructive. That is, on the whole, if you have a city which eats up a lot of land, spreads horizontally that way, and therefore relies on people using private transport to actually get from the outskirts into the city every day. So think Los Angeles, think Mexico City, think Sao Paulo. Unfortunately, what you're getting are land-hungry cities which use up too much energy now. All these things are negative. What can cities do in the future to actually reverse these trends? Well, at one level, it's going back to what makes cities cities, which is making them more compact. Having people live close together is what actually we've been doing for thousands of years. We've been moving from the countryside to seek protection, but also to seek engagement of being close to each other in order to do transactions of many things. Transactions of work, transactions of knowledge. We meet in cities to go to be educated, to go to institutions of learning, to meet people who we otherwise wouldn't normally meet in order to improve our prospects of whatever it may be, making money, getting better knowledge, etc. And cities are all about that as long as you don't have to sit in a car on your own for hours commuting. So one way to make a city better is to make it more compact, and therefore it's both socially and economically more sustainable. Another thing which is fundamental in sort of cities of the future is to make sure that they are democratic. I mean, I think without cities having real democratic engagement of its citizens, it's very unlikely that you will get fair and just environments. And this is a very profound issue, because we think of places like Mexico City, which has something like 22 million people. In reality, there are only 6 or 7 million people who belong to something called the Distrito Federal, which is the central part of the city which has a mayor. The rest don't even belong to Mexico City, so they can't vote for essential services like water, or they can't have a view as to whether they want to improve air quality. And that's why you get some of the sort of very negative developments of a city like that. In London, instead, a city where we are now, you actually have, or have had now for nearly 15 years, a very clear system of governance. You have one elected mayor. If we don't like him after 4 years, we throw him out. And this person can, in a way, interpret the vision of the city from the democratic point of view. So, 2 examples. The Mayor of London has determined that the city will continue to grow, but with a green belt around it. That means that it won't sprawl forever. That means that it will be much more efficient. The other thing the mayor was able to do, in this case Mayor Livingston, was to introduce congestion charging. That was put to the vote, and he was re-elected. The following mayor, the current mayor, Mayor Boris Johnson, has kept that very important idea and actually introduced the famous Boris bikes. Now, these are things that need political accountability. So the way a city is governed is as important as the way it's designed. And those 2 elements, I think, are central to making better cities. Well, when one talks about cities now moving towards having something like 75% of the world's population living in them by 2050, this is a massive change from about 110 years ago, when it was only 10%. When one thinks of that as a statistic of rate of change, there are 2 very critical other statistics that one has to bear in mind. One is that 1 out of every 3 new urban dweller will be living in slums. That's the United Nations statistic. Another one is that 75% of the world's CO2 emissions actually come from cities. Now, in a way that's obvious, because cities are where people create things, they make things, they use energy in order to be productive. Now, if one were to actually slightly change the sort of efficiency of cities, and instead of them being terribly over excessive in terms of the way they use energy, but be more efficient, then you can actually help rebalance the world ecology. I mean, if it's 75% of CO2 emissions, if you can cut that by 10 or 15 or 20%, you really are talking about making a big change. The other issue, which is, I think, to a degree, a social bomb waiting to explode, is that if cities like Mumbai, if cities like Lima, if cities like Jakarta continue growing at the level that they are, where more than half the population lives in slums, it is only a question of time that you will have massive social confrontations. And that's where the favelas, the slums, those areas that, you know, certainly have their own life to them, and many writers have talked about that recently, and I think very convincingly. These are not dead areas, these are not no-go areas, they're very much part of the thriving global city in many ways. One has to retrofit these areas, one has to improve them, one has to provide them with services like schools, like sanitation, like water, in such a way that you get sort of minimum civic rights, or as David Harvey refers to it, the right to the city. These elements need to be addressed just as much as the environmental footprint of a city. So there are these 2 axes, social inclusion and environmental responsibility, right at the heart of the future of cities. Well, one of the most important questions that anyone who's involved in planning or deciding the future of cities, a politician or a policymaker, an architect or a landscape designer, is how can you intervene in cities as they change in such a way that it's a win-win, that you actually make an investment that works for within reasonable and realistic financial constraints at the time, but also doesn't turn the place that you're investing in or trying to change into something which in a very short period of time deteriorates, or worse, becomes a sort of negative place. Now, nowhere is this debate more sharply focused than in what is happening right now in East London, in Stratford. For many of us who live in London, we're not aware that we're actually living in a city which is deeply unequal, actually, and in many ways as unequal as São Paulo or Mumbai. Because if someone like me is brought up and is living in West London, not far from the Royal Geographical Society, you live to an average age of 78 or 80 years old. If I get onto the underground and take the tube eastwards to Stratford, every stop I go east, I lose 1 year in life expectancy. So life expectancy for a man in East London is around 72, 71. And that's because of diet, it's because of drinking, it's because of higher levels of unemployment, lower levels of education, and all these issues. So the question around the Olympics is, how could maybe one use an event of this sort, with the concentration of money and public money and a deadline, to literally rebalance London? And that's what the planning of the legacy of the Olympics is all about. Now, how do you do that? Well, you can't do it overnight, is the first thing. You've got to think not what happens in a week's time when we end these games, or in a month's time when the Paralympic Games open. Nothing will happen, actually. There'll be less traffic on the streets, and different countries will be celebrating their medals. That's all that will happen. But the way it's been designed, this whole project, and I've been part of that as chief advisor on architecture and urbanism to the Olympic Delivery Authority for about 4 years. The way it's been designed is to actually think now, what could happen over a 15, 20, or even 25-year period? How do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is you decontaminate an area which is otherwise polluted and contaminated, which that whole Stratford zone was. For generations it had been basically a massive dump. Of course there are people living nearby, there are allotments, there are places with a lot of identity for certain people, but on the whole, many of the areas were used for industries which became redundant. So a classic phenomenon of the 20th century, early 20th century industrial city. So that was one important issue. But the second thing is that this is a site, Stratford generally, which is incredibly well connected. You can use the tube or train or overground and underground and get to actually many different parts, not only of London, but of the UK relatively easily. So it's a good place to create a sustainable community, and there was a lot of available land. Now, when you put these two things together, you really have the potential for making what I call a new piece of city. And you do this by creating the veins, the infrastructure, the streets, the bridges, the parks, the networks, which are there and are accessible to everybody. They're not just accessible to the few. It's not like Canary Wharf, can I say, which I think is a very interesting place, but ultimately you only go there to work. 100,000 people now work there, but it's not really what one would say is part of London. Doesn't feel like, let's say, parts of North London, parts of West London, where you don't feel afraid, so to speak, because, to go there because you don't belong there. So the first thing that has been done is create the streets and the infrastructure that I described. The second is to place those institutions of social life, schools, health centers, parks, and other facilities, and probably most importantly jobs. And partly it's happening at the major shopping center which has been built. And only a few weeks ago they announced that the broadcast center is going to be turned into something called the iCity initiative, which will create something like 4,000 or 5,000 jobs in the knowledge, high-tech sort of knowledge areas. There'll be actually some production facilities as well. And then you create housing. But you create housing in such a way that it happens slowly over time so that you can build community. But all of this requires a very resilient and flexible plan, which is the master plan that was actually given planning permission only a few weeks ago. Now, boy does it help to have £9.3 billion of public money to start the process. But you could misspend that money just as well. You could have created one enclave that when the fence comes down in a month or so's time, that area would have remained isolated. I think when the fence comes down over the next 10, 20 years, you have the pieces of a jigsaw which is much more complex and much more like the rest of London. Well, I think cities have always shown enormous resilience, or their residents have shown greatest resilience when things are hard and times are tough. And as I, with my colleagues here at the LSE, have studied places like Bogota in Colombia, Medellin, another city in Colombia, which only a few years ago had one of the highest murder rates in the world, or the back streets of slums in Dharavi and Mumbai, you do find this extraordinary resilience. Now, what do I mean by that? At one level, you have governments, city governments, which are, instead of having available large amounts of money like we do here in London for the Olympics, have to get by on much less. So, for example, in Curitiba in Brazil or in Bogota in Colombia, different mayors have invested in very, very simple systems of cycleways and metro buses, as they're called, which go in dedicated lanes, which cost 1/20th of an underground system and actually transport just as many people very, very efficiently. Basically allowing those at the bottom end of the scale access to transport and access to jobs and access to education. So very, very important part of the process, and we can learn enormously from that by seeing how these things are done. Then you actually go down to a smaller scale of nearly the family unit and see what people can do in terms of their creativity. And I've been struck by some of the initiatives I've seen. I'm part of a group called the Deutsche Bank Urban Age Award, which every year gives £100,000 to bottom-up projects, let's call it. And we've done that for 5 or 6 years. And most recently we gave that prize in Cape Town to a group of mothers, women, who got together and brought together some containers, shipping containers, unused ones, arranged them in a courtyard sort of space and provided food and education for the ones who need it most in these slums. That is kids below the age of 5. They're otherwise abandoned and forgotten. And this is in a country, South Africa, which is actually quite well off. You know, the average income is, but this is a group of people in society who've been abandoned and forgotten. Similarly, in the back streets of one of the slums in Mumbai, we found that a group of individuals, men and women, got together to take one of their incredibly sordid community toilets, as they're called. They have no running water, no sewers in their homes, so they have to have community toilets, which are in terrible condition. And they just put their house in order. They restructured it, divided it between men and women, and on top of it created a communal kitchen and some learning rooms for the kids. This has totally transformed the prospects of some of the young people who are going to grow there, totally transformed the relationship between women who can talk to each other in privacy about their problems with their husbands and their lovers and their fathers who probably beat them in the evening and abuse them because of alcohol. So there's a clear link, even at the smaller scale, between architecture, design, public space in particular, and the prospects of people actually improving the quality of lives in cities.